Hello, everyone. I am very excited to interview Dr. Lauren McClenney-Rosenstein today. Here's a quick bio about Dr. Lauren. Dr. Lauren's passion for educating, advocating, and bringing awareness to dyslexia at the domestic and international levels began in the elementary classrooms of private schools serving students with language-based learning disabilities. She has been a certified special education educator for a decade, and she earned her Doctor of Education in Teaching, Learning, Leadership, and Curriculum in 2019 from Northeastern University, and she holds a dual master's in special education and elementary education from Syracuse University and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Syracuse University. Her dedication to providing the gold standard of instruction to individuals with dyslexia led her to obtain her endorsement at the associate level through the Orton Gillingham Academy in 2014. Eventually, she expanded her skill set in the public schools as a 7th and 8th grade math and English language arts co-teacher before taking a position with a nonprofit organization that advocates for inclusion in public schools for students with disabilities. She also worked as a middle school learning specialist, instructional coach, and served on the administrative team. Dr. Lauren is the CEO and founder of Think Dyslexia. Dr. Lauren is a mother of two, and her husband is a middle school educator. She has 2 birds, 1 German Shepherd, and a cat. Here's Dr. Lauren. Hello, everyone. So I'm very excited to interview one of our board members today, Dr. Lauren. And I was very struck by a blog post that she wrote called The Nefarious Confluence of Race, Schooling, and Dyslexia. And I think in this blog post that Dr. Lauren brings up some very important historical context and issues that we should all be talking about or understand in our literacy advocacy or our understanding of the entire literacy space, because I don't believe that it always is as inclusive as we would like it to be. And so with that, I'm going to just jump into the first question, which is if you could explain the barriers that African-American children face becoming skilled readers that's maybe different than let's say white children.
Yeah, sure. So I think I tried to kind of highlight 4 parts to it. So I think, obviously this could be a conversation within itself,
Yes.
but I think a lot of it really boils down to privileged and underprivileged. So, if you look at the tiers of just Black and white, typically, as I've spoken about before, and I know this is a later question, but dyslexia seems to be more of a whitewashed field. You see more white kids, you see white adults, but really the bottom line is dyslexia doesn't discriminate at all. It just boils down to privilege, knowledge, money. I mean, all of these things are things that if you're not in the upper echelon, and I hate to say that, but it kind of is true, you don't have the privilege to know the knowledge to then maybe have the financial capital to know I need to get an Orton Gillingham tutor, or I need to send my child to a specialized school. I also think there's a lack of representation and to be quite transparent, racism. So in that article, I stated there was a statistic I stated about, I think it was academic year of 1999, and then I think it was like 20 years later. And so it was comparing side by side the statistics of white teachers versus teachers of color. And I believe in like 1999, it was maybe 85% white and like 7% teachers of color. And then 20 years later, like 2019 or whatever year it was, I think maybe the white teachers went down like 2% and the Black teachers went up like 8%. And so, if you're a student of color, like how I was, I didn't really see a lot of representation. So if you don't have educators that look like you, that understand your cultural backgrounds, it makes it, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it makes it harder for there to be that connection of, I understand this child's struggles, or, I really, I experienced that too. So here's what worked for me, or here's what could help this family. And then when you tack on racism, some of it is implicit, some of it is explicit, some of it are microaggressions, some of it is your own personal biases. I mean, there are some white teachers that don't mean to do harm, but their immediate thought is, well, if this Black kid is acting out, well, they immediately need to go to special ed, or they immediately need to go to the front office, versus a white student could do the same behaviors and maybe they're treated a little bit differently, or, whatever the case is. So I think, the representation and the, explicit and implicit racism really impacts the barriers. And I think low expectations. I think in general, if teachers have high expectations for all learners, and as you stated before, the inclusive mindset, like, I don't think teachers go into education to be exclusive or to purposely be, misrepresenting kids. I really don't. I think it really boils down to context of who you are, what your background was, what work you've done on your own terms, and what are your expectations. Maybe you grew up in an area where you didn't see a lot of kids of color. So maybe your expectations of them are a lot lower and you don't realize that. So if you rise, you have a high expectation for your students, they'll rise to the occasion. But I think far too often, unfortunately, a lot of Black kids, the expectation's very low. And so kids live up to the expectations you give them. And, and I think the other part is lack of knowledge. So unfortunately, in the Black community, we just don't talk about disabilities in the way that white communities do. And I think it's really a negative stigma. It's a feeling of like, oh, well, we're always labeled, so we don't need to label ourselves. So there's not a lot of community around, let's really explore this. And I think there's also a fear of, if a white teacher, depending on the circumstances, are labeling per se a child, they might see it as a negative, not like, well, this teacher could be helping my child. Instead, it's more of, I don't want my child labeled because they're going to be in the system. And that's actually a common phrase that you hear a lot sometimes in the Black community. I don't want my kid in the system. And really what the system is the pipeline to prison. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but those were some things that I was thinking off the top of my head when you asked that question about the barriers.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I think we've had this discussion before, because I mean, even in our own advocacy work in, let's say, the less diverse suburbs where there's a lot of anger about kids struggling to read and, largely white, maybe not getting reimbursement for private schools or not getting the interventions that are helping them become skilled readers. And then we're out in maybe a more high needs community where we're located, which is largely Black and brown communities, and we're meeting with parents and guardians and lots of grandparents. And we're not talking about dyslexia, we're talking about literacy and trying to just give them education and tools. And it's very different worlds.
Right.
And it's very obvious. We're not talking about dyslexia in some of these communities. And then, I know in the schools, for many of the reasons that you just brought up, that these kids aren't getting identified.
Right.
And that's hopefully with some of the policies and some of the, as the culture starts to shift a little, that will change. But you pointed out so many barriers that it is it certainly is there's certainly a lot of complexity to it. And that really leads me to my next question I have for you is how has this culture that you saw, how has it influenced your work, which, obviously this is your passion?
So I think for me, I've had to really, since I wrote this article 2 years ago, I think this was a time for me to really reflect on my own schooling. I grew up upper middle class, predominantly white community, and it was not uncommon for me to be the token Black. I'll put it that way. And I think when you grow up in that bubble, that's kind of all you know, versus if you grow up in, a city where there's more multicultural backgrounds and foods and all of that, like you, you only know what you know. And so when I first started working at a private dyslexic school, I still remember I think I was the only Black employee there. And it didn't dawn on me until like a year later that I was like, well, what about Black dyslexic kids in the city? And I was in the suburbs of Atlanta, so I knew where I was working was very affluent. And I stopped and I thought about it. I was like, what about the kids in the Atlanta public school system where they could really benefit from this Orton Gillingham approach? And this was over a decade ago, that I was like processing this. And so as I was moving my way into, the schools, I still didn't, I don't think internalized that I had this knowledge that could actually impact the Brown and Black community until 2020, when like everything kind of racially was starting to bubble up and come out. And, Robin DiAngelo's white fragility was like a hot buzz topic that teachers were talking about. And depending on who you spoke to, some teachers loved it, some teachers hated it. And then it was just a whole bunch of just uproar about, well, what does it mean to be a Black educator? What does it mean to be a white educator? And how can you really impact kids? And so I think, I realized that I had an influence in, well, what was my schooling experience? And I struggled in school myself. And I've mentioned that many times in interviews. So I think for me, it was just kind of like a aha moment for me. And I think that's what really sparked that article, where I was like, I've worked with so many Brown and Black kids that have been on my caseload, and, their disability wasn't whatever the initial disability was per se, because maybe there was a reading issue, maybe they were initially evaluated because of a behavioral issue, when really maybe they were depressed because they couldn't read. Or maybe, they had other, their anxiety because of circumstances in their lives, like whatever it is. So I think, I've become more vocal now with kids that have disabilities to really talk about, well, here's what it feels like to be a person of color with this learning difference. It doesn't make you less than. Let's just educate ourselves about this. So then we have the tools to equip ourselves, because I didn't know what was wrong with me when I was in school until I turned 21, when I got my diagnosis of ADHD. So, I mean, if I had the resources or someone to tell me, hey, Lauren, you're actually really smart, it's just you learn this way. I mean, my journey is my journey. I don't, take away from that, but I just want to be able to be that support for all kids. But I mean, more specifically, those Brown and Black kids who might be questioning, well, I don't fit in, and how come this kid gets this and I don't get that? And well, the expectations are low for me. No, the expectations should be up here for all kids, especially all kids of color. So I know that was kind of like all over the place, but I was really trying to think about like my experiences and how that impacted me being an educator, and how I really have kind of shifted vocalizing more about, here's what's going on with the Brown and Black kids more often. I mean, I do that mostly with all students, but I think I'm more like vocal about it with them, because I want them to know and have that knowledge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, again, the next question though is, I mean, and I have some thoughts about this too, but then how can we start to create more diversity in our advocacy, whether it's at the awareness level of reaching people where they are, or educating the parents and guardians, educating the school? How can we start to how can we add some diversity to this? How can we be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big question. I mean, I'm an advocate of talking. I don't avoid. I think that more than often, people will avoid the elephant in the room. It's easier to just talk about something else, or it's easier to dance around the statistics or whatever it is. I think let's just call it what it is. Let's call it dyslexia and actually talk about it. Let's actually say, you know what? I can speak for the Black community, let's talk about mental health issues. Let's talk about learning disabilities, but not in a way to shun people, but in a way to actually say, you know what, maybe my child needs supports. Maybe my child needs help. I did an interview with a colleague of mine who she's a Black speech language pathologist, and she's a pediatric language pathologist, and she specializes in dyslexia as well. And one of the topics we focused on was, for some reason in the Black community, I'm sure this happens in other communities, but again, I'm just speaking from my perspective. It's always like, oh, little Johnny didn't talk until he was 5, and look at him now, he's great. And there's this like misconception of, well, what is that? So we're just going to sit back and say, well, so-and-so had all these I mean, really, that's what it is. It's a language delay. And we're just going to skip over that and realize that grandma had this issue and uncle had this. I mean, there's so many things that I've noticed talking to, like interviewing Black dyslexics versus white dyslexics. And no, I have not done I don't have data to aggregate, but I mean, literally like interviewing these Black dyslexics, their stories are just horrifying, because it literally is like, well, my mom couldn't read, or I didn't do this, or I had to decode text for my grandma. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like this, we have to talk about it. Like we have to actually say, I think there's something wrong. Let me ask for help. And I find that in the white community, that is more accepted. And I think it's more knowledgeable. I mean, and even more so, interviewing white dyslexics, I hear, I was diagnosed when I was 5. I was diagnosed when I was 8. My mom was a school psychologist, but then you think about the Black community, it's like, I was diagnosed at 30 and I'm 32, and it's just, it's mind boggling. And it really tells me like, we need to talk about it more. So I think for one, schools need to address it. And I know that this is a state thing, this is a district thing, all of that, but schools need to address it. Teachers need to understand screeners, early warning signs, and they need to know how to talk to families, but they also need to understand and check their own biases. They also need to understand, like, if I'm talking to this Black family who is very resistant, there are ways to kind of finagle that conversation in. And I know that's another conversation, but I mean, I really think the big picture here is we've got to talk about it. And I'm encouraging the Black community, let's talk about it. Let's not just keep brushing it aside and say, this will pass. Grandma had that. Oh, I struggled with that too. But now look at me. That's unacceptable. That's low expectations, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess a question I have for you too, and I had initially had this on our question list too, is, how we, just how even as publishers or resources, how we can better support this inclusion, because I know that we often get some pushback of don't even in our little library we host, I don't want to see another book with white kids and animals. And
yes, I was going to actually touch on that. So representation in text is huge. I mean, I know that with teaching my kid to read. Mm-hmm. Like my daughter is biracial. So I have 2 daughters, actually. I have a daughter who's white. I have a daughter who's half Black and white. And so we make sure, my husband's Jewish. We make sure they're books with Jewish heritage. We make sure that there are books about her Black hair. We make sure there are books about her being a girl, her being a Black girl, she has representation in so many different books. I don't ever remember seeing that. I don't ever remember picking up a book about my hair and the texture and the styles. So I think that all of that is so important. And that's another form of representation. It needs to be in literature, and it needs to be people of color teaching it too.
Is there anything else that you want to add about this important topic, or just tools? Is anything that we can do to start to, again, I guess I've said it several times, but just be a more inclusive community to support literacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, finding literature that is important. I think the biggest thing that I think about when I see teachers' posts and stuff on Instagram, don't just have books about Christmas, don't just have books just about Hanukkah and think that's the other culture. Like find other things that are going on in the Indian community, in the Black community, and all communities. So kids know this is multicultural. This isn't just whitewashed. So I think definitely doing some research on literature that represents, even if you have a class of mostly white kids, they should still learn, differences. And also too, I think, oh, actually I wanted to say I'm in the works of writing a book, which I'm really excited about. Very early stages. I'm outlining it right now, but basically it's going to be similar to what we're talking about, educating more so the Black community, because that's my experience, but really the brown and Black community about early indicators, community. Like we need to change the narrative here. So it's not just just white folks in the dyslexia community, and it's going to be focused on dyslexia. It's more of a parent hand guide, a guide, if you will, to let them know, like, here are some resources, here's what you should be looking into, here are some options of interventions, and kind of come from that holistic approach. So I know there's a lot to unpack with this, but I think definitely representation in the classroom, in books. I think, really checking your own personal biases to understand your context of where you're coming from. If you are a white teacher going into a space of really connecting and communicating with Black and brown families, because I know that makes a difference when you have an understanding rather than telling a family or a kid, this is what's going on, or whatever that might look like.
Absolutely. And I'll do a tiny plug on our website, teachmykidtoread.org. Under our free little library, we keep a nice link, a wish list of diverse books that we include in our little library. We have a few decodables, a lot of authentic textbooks, and we're pretty careful about that list. And when your book comes out, it'll also be on our wish list. And we also, well, Teach My Kid to Read, we're part of the Read in Color program through Free Little Library, and that's a great resource for diverse books in all types of cultures and backgrounds. But boy, you gave us a lot of information, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you. And that I want to once again say the name of the blog post that inspired me to start talking to you more about this topic is called "The Nefarious Confluence of Race, Schooling, and Dyslexia." It's a mouthful, but just a very important and well done blog post, and I'm glad we got to expound on some of the topics, and I'll look forward to having more discussions with you, Dr. Lauren.
Yes, thank you so much, Marion. This was a great short conversation,
Yes.
but we know that it's the first of many. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Take care, everybody.